Okay, so before we get started, I want to show you how to hold the instrument properly. This is a really important section of the video because if you don't do this right, everything I show you afterwards is going to be much more difficult. So what you'll notice at the bottom of the instrument here is something I call the palm cradle. It's a concave area that's molded right into the base. What you want to do is take your palm and just put it right in the cradle, like that. And then you want to hold it against your body. Now take your index finger and put it parallel to the band, like this. So now take your finger and curve it up like this. This becomes your hammer. Notice that your palm will pivot inside the cradle. That's exactly what you want. Hold it against your body, and that's how you get your rhythms with this finger. So that's how the lower hand works. Now for the upper hand, what you want to do, I like to do the toy gun position. You want to take your instrument and put it in the crook of your hand and bend your thumb over like that. So now you're supporting the instrument and these fingers are free to play. So what we're going to start with is just having your hand rest on the band like this. So this is a good starting position. Now we're going to go into technique. Okay, so now that you know how to hold the instrument right, we're going to go into something I call the drum technique. This is the simplest technique to start with. And I call it the drum technique because what you're doing is using the metal band as a drum head. You're not going for melody, you're just going for the open tone, like that, or you're muting it with this hand and using the closed tone. And you're doing combinations of just those two notes. For the open tone, all you're doing is letting the instrument ring out by not touching the band. For the muted tone or the closed tone, you're just closing your fingers around the band, not tightly, but just enough to mute it. So I like to start with a pattern. Sounds like this. Now sped up, sounds like this. And of course you can simplify the pattern if you want. Or you can play an odd time, like let's say 5. And just like any percussion instrument, as tempting as it is to go fast, you really want to focus on accuracy first. So just work on combinations. Anything you want, and just work on those two notes. So that's called the drum technique. Okay, now I want to show you something I call the bend. And what I'm doing here is I'm flexing the instrument while I'm playing it. Even though this is a really rigid piece of aluminum, it does have a little bit of flexibility to it. You can't actually see it bend because it's barely bending, but you can hear it really clearly. So what I'm doing when I'm playing it is I'm flexing the instrument away from my body by grabbing it up by the label and using my palm to push it from the back. It's just like doing this, but I'm doing it in the playing position. So my palm is doing all the work from the back side. So it's like. So what I want to do is show you that original pattern. But we're going to add a bend to the end of it. It goes like this. That's called the bend. Okay, up to this point we've been getting most of the tone out of the instrument by using the open tone and then muted tones. Remember that, the drum technique, we're doing that kind of thing. Now I want to show you how to get notes. And the way that's done is using what's called the hammer-on technique. And this is a very common technique with guitar players. So what you're doing here is instead of just muting the note with these fingers, you're taking your middle finger and you're hammering certain locations on the band to get notes. Now I'm just doing it randomly, but what you want to do is hit them right on the holes. Right on the markings on the side will give you half steps, just like the frets on a guitar. This is one area where the slapstick is really different from a guitar, because on a guitar you fret the different parts of the string, but then you get your notes down here by strumming it. With this technique you're tapping out the notes with this hand, so it's like this. So Very different from just using the open note. So I can take that same pattern, and instead of just muting the note, I'll tap the note out. Same pattern, but it'll sound like this. Instead of. Now, even though it looks pretty easy, this is probably the hardest thing to get right. It takes a lot of practice to build the finger muscle up to be able to get nice solid. And it'll hurt a little bit at first when you practice. So what I would recommend doing is just taking like the 3rd fret. 3rd fret is kind of a nice, comfortable place to be. And just practice. Just do that at first, and then try 2 different notes. You're not going for speed here, you're going for just nice solid hits. And then after you're comfortable with that, try doing some notes in between these notes with this hand, like this. Again, you're going for solid tones. So here's a nice little pattern you can practice that just uses 3 notes. Okay, now we've covered the drum technique and the hammer-on technique and the bend. Now what I'd like to do is put all 3 techniques together. Let me do it faster. So if you're listening closely to a lot of these patterns, you're going to notice that these tones are not always perfectly clean. Like, sometimes they'll sound slightly different. What I'm doing is I'm picking out little sections along the band and hitting these in really precise locations. And instead of using just the pad of my finger, I'm using my fingernail. And the part that's the hardest to see here is that instead of just hitting with the fingernail and releasing, I'm letting it sit for just a fraction of a second before I lift off. And that's what creates this. There's no effects here, it's plugged directly into the amp, so this is what's coming off the band. And then if you combine it with a bend, you get another cool effect. There's a whole lot you can do with this, and it's very subtle, and it's something, again, that takes a little bit of practice at first, and then it just becomes this automatic thing that you do. I don't even think about it half the time now. So for example, we'll go back to that first pattern again. That's just using the tip of my finger, but if I use my fingernail in different places, it sounds like this. Again, with the end of my finger, and with harmonics. So there's just a whole lot you can do with these harmonics, and most of them happen just in this first little section where your hand is going to be anyways. So just play around with different locations, use your fingernail, and you'll find that it'll just start happening, and it just adds a whole different flavor to what you're doing with the instrument. Using electronic effects is a really exciting way to expand the sound of the slapstick, and because this instrument uses a standard 1/4-inch jack along with a passive pickup like a guitar, anything that's available on the market already will work. So you have a whole lot you can choose from there. This is the unit that I've been using a lot lately. This is an RP1000. It's actually a pretty old unit. It's about 8 years old, but it has some sounds that I haven't heard in any other effects unit that I've tried. So we're going to use this and go through a few different sounds. Okay, I got the effects pedal on the floor, plugged in and ready to go. And before I run through the different sounds, I just want to say one thing. It's really important, I believe, not to let effects replace technique. And the reason I say that is because it's very easy to play poorly and sound great if you hide behind a big effect, especially a distortion. So when you practice your technique, you always want to plug directly into the amp and get a real clean sound so you can really work on. A clean sound is very honest. It's very brutally honest. You can hear your mistakes, and you can't hear your mistakes behind something like. Play clean when you're doing your technique. Think of it as a workout. And then, and only then, move on to effects, because you want to be able to, if you can do this, then this will sound good. Very clean. So, that said, let's get on to the different sounds. The one I like to play the most is called the wah effect, or the envelope filter. Sounds like this. Pretty obvious why I like that sound. It's very percussive, and it's just really funky and very universal sounding, and people really seem to like that sound, especially when it comes off of a stick that's only this big. That's the envelope filter. Okay, the next one I want to show you is called Space. Now, unlike the envelope filter, this sound is very big sounding. It's not very percussive. It's more very spacey, and it's really good for doing stuff like. Anyways, you get the idea. You can go on for days with this sound, get lost in it. Here's another sound I like. It's kind of a flanger. It sounds a lot like Pink Floyd's Run Like Hell. Just a really spacey but kind of rhythmic sound, kind of a combination of the first two I just showed you. And this one works really well with the harmonics. It really brings out the. Some effects will really bring that out, and some effects will bury that sound. So that's another fun thing about using different effects, is you can bring out different aspects that are natural to the instrument, or sometimes bury them. It depends on what it is. So this is another one here. This is it's called Thin, and the name is pretty descriptive. It doesn't have any bottom end. It's like. Somewhat of a limited sound, but it's good for playing over the top of other things, and it's sometimes a great kind of a rhythmic component, kind of equivalent to like a shaker would be in percussion. So I use that sound a lot. Now we're going to get into the weird stuff. This one's called Whammy, and check this out. Anyways, it's kind of just its own weird thing, and this one is called Uber. This one's kind of a strange combination of like distortion and something else. Pretty cool, very big sounding, very just like this huge type of sound. And then, of course, everyone's favorite, distortion. Everyone recognizes that one. It's very Jimi Hendrix, very big. Again, this is a sound that is really fun, but you can also hide kind of bad technique behind it. I can play just something real sloppy. I'm kind of playing sloppy and it still sounds good, or if I play that same thing clean, it doesn't sound that good. And that's why I said earlier, you really want to get your technique down and then add effects to it, because you don't want to get into the habit of hiding behind things like distortion. But I really emphasize learning the technique, getting it down really clean and precise, and then it just makes all this stuff better. Okay, so all of this time I've been showing you this instrument holding it like this. So what I'd like to do now is show you an alternative way to play it horizontally. This is a really fun way to introduce the instrument to children. It's just a very easy way to start making sounds right away without having to worry about where your hands are or anything like that. So what I'm going to do is put this across my knees just like this, and you play it in a very familiar manner, just like hitting a drum. So what I'd like to do for this demo is run it through an envelope filter, because it really brings out the high sound. Without it, it sounds like this. And with the envelope, it sounds like this. Notice it really brings out the high-pitched sound. And just like before, you can use the drum technique. And you can also do the hammer-on technique. I like to use my fingers together like this. It gives me a little more force on the band. Very fun way to play. And another thing that's nice about this position is you can really crank up the tuning really high, all the way to the top of the range. You can tune it way down to the bottom of the range too. I love that wah effect. It really brings out the high, even when it's tuned down really low. Another thing you can do is you can bend it, same way that you do this, but you can bend it by pushing it over your knees. You can put that in a rhythm as well. You have to be careful when bending it like this, because you have to release with both hands at the same time. Like that. If you don't, it does that. So that's called the horizontal technique. Okay, now that I've shown you a few of the effects that I like to use, I'm going to take those same sounds and use them in different combinations to create 3 different musical pieces. I'm going to use a looper to do this. This is a Digitech Jam Man. It's a very straightforward, simple looper, only 1 channel, 2 pedals. So this first piece starts with a simple 3-note bass line using the hammer-on technique that I showed you earlier. So check it out. This is called bass line. Okay, for this next piece I call Space Funk, I'm not using a clean sound like before to start the piece. Instead, I'm going to use the wah pedal. We're going to start like that. Check it out. This last piece, called Heavy Cloud, has a whole different feel to it. I'm going to be using distortion instead of going and washing over the piece. I'm going to use it to start the piece with a type of subdued rhythm. Which also pulls out a lot of the harmonics in the instrument. So check it out, Heavy Cloud. So here's a few little tricks I'd like to show you, just some things you can add to your playing. The first one's called a slide. Pretty simple, you just slide while you hit at the same time. Kind of a cool way to end a piece when you combine it with the bend. And you can also use a slide in a rhythmic kind of way within a piece. With an envelope filter, it sounds like this. So you can do a lot of stuff like that with it. Now one thing I do, I don't know if you caught it in the video, whenever I slide, I use my index finger and not my middle finger, the one I usually use to play. I switch to the index finger because it's a little stronger, but it also allows me to reach over with my middle finger and add notes like this. So I can go. Again with the envelope. As soon as I get close to the pickup, then I bring my middle finger up and over. So I can combine it with this finger and do what's called a rough, which is a really quick triplet. And you can also do what's called a flam, which is 2 notes real quick. You can do a bunch of little patterns in a row. Another thing you can do if you're playing horizontally is you can use your fingers kind of like a tabla player. Okay, so now that you know how to hold the instrument right, we're going to go into something I call the drum technique. This is the simplest technique to start with. And I call it the drum technique because what you're doing is using the metal band as a drum head. You're not going for melody, you're just going for the open tone, like that, or you're muting it with this hand and using the closed tone. And you're doing combinations of just those 2 notes. For the open tone, all you're doing is letting the instrument ring out by not touching the band. For the muted tone or the closed tone, you're just closing your fingers around the band, not tightly, but just enough to mute it. So I like to start with the pattern. Sounds like this. Now sped up, sounds like this. And of course you can simplify the pattern if you want. Or you can play an odd time, like let's say 5. And just like any percussion instrument, as tempting as it is to go fast, you really want to focus on accuracy first. So just work on combinations. Anything you want, and just work on those 2 notes. So that's called the drum technique.